I drew a complete comic cover for an art contest, and I'll show you exactly how I did it. I'll walk you through the whole process. The first ideas, the first sketch, the drawing, the inking, and finally the typical awesome comic book coloring. Let's go. So, Todd McFarlane, the incredible artist and creator of the Spawn comic, held an awesome challenge. Every artist who deemed himself worthy was invited to draw several Spawn characters. And 4 of them had the chance to become an actual, real comic book cover. Naturally, I asked myself, would I have a chance? So, I decided to jump in and started sketching some basic ideas. So, as you can see, the first thing I did here was that I put 10 blank covers on one canvas. The purpose of this was to just lay down some basic ideas, so I just wanted to get many of those done. And by putting them all on one canvas, I was never really tempted to zoom in too much. I was just trying to lay down basic ideas without going into any details. And I was kind of forcing myself to put all on one canvas and work at this level of zoom. And this makes it basically impossible to draw really many details. The first assignment for the challenge was to draw Spawn. And as it happens, I want to get better at portrait drawing this year. So naturally I settled for a portrait, a close-up portrait of Spawn. The question here basically was what perspective I would use and how close I would zoom in on Spawn. In the first sketch you can see that I played with the idea to have a hand in the foreground or some kind of foreground element to make it a bit more interesting, but in the end I just didn't do it. Now the cool thing about a portrait like this and a close-up image is that it kind of really draws you in and it makes you feel like you would be right in front of Spawn, you know? And it kind of has the chance to convey emotion. Of course, Spawn has a mask, so it won't convey many emotions. But still, even those eyes, even if you don't really see a pupil or an iris, can still convey a lot of emotion. In this case, they can make him look evil. In the end, I kind of settled for a 3/4 view, to make it a little bit more interesting than a straight front view. The question now was, would I go for something semi-realistic or for something more graphic or comic book style? And actually I wanted to do a relatively realistic painting, so I started playing around with that one sketch on the top here and kind of laid down some basic colors and rendering to see how it would look. And I kind of liked it, but still I had so many ideas. Another idea I had was to kind of make it like a black and white painting, but to use red instead of white. And that's what I tried at the bottom here. But then I thought, well, maybe that's a little bit too basic. I don't know. In the next idea I tried to make it also graphic, but maybe a little bit more interesting by adding red, black and just made the cape red. But still I kind of felt like I needed a black background to make everything look more dark and evil. So in my final thumbnail painting I kind of opted for basic colors with a black background and some kind of greenish backlight. But as you will see, I kind of went another route and made it more traditional comic book style. This is actually the most important step of the entire painting. Believe it or not, these paintings took 2 hours. Now, as soon as I had an idea in mind, I kind of just resized one of those little paintings and drew a very loose sketch on top of that. As you can see here, I started with a basic Loomis head, where you draw kind of a circle and the side plane of the head, yada yada yada, you know the drill. And I kind of made it a bit more detailed than the thumbnail painting, but it was still raw. The purpose of the first sketch is just to get the shapes right and the proportions. It's not about an accurate drawing here, it's not about details, it's just about the general shapes and the proportions. Because if those are not right, there's no point in making an intricate drawing out of it. And while the first little idea paintings took 2 hours, this only took 20 minutes. Still, I decided to sleep on it one night, and the next day I noticed that I wanted to put more flow into the cape. It was kind of just hanging there, you know, so I kind of drew it the other way and switched the lines to the left. Now it was time to start the final drawing, and the final drawing is just a refined drawing based on the sketch. The idea here is to just use clearer lines, and where there are maybe 10 lines above each other in the sketch, you just basically use one line above it and make it a bit thicker and black. To make it a bit more interesting, I used a dynamic stroke thickness here. If every line was equally as thick everywhere, it would kind of just look digital and boring. So I kind of used a dynamic brush where the more you press on the pen, the thicker the stroke gets. But to be honest, Artistically, there was really no rhyme or reason here. I just did it by feel. And actually I changed one thing compared to the sketch here. In the sketch there was this chain flying around and I kind of felt this was out of place, so I replaced it with a chain that's actually holding his cape together because, well, that's what Spawn has and he didn't have it in my sketch. Once again, I slept on it one night and kind of noticed two things I wanted to change. First, I didn't like the chest muscles at all, they kind of just looked wrong. So I looked at some reference images from actual bodybuilders in this case and just redid them. And actually I used fewer lines than before. And secondly, I just wanted it to look even more evil because it was just not evil enough. It's Spawn, come on. So what I did was I made the eyes just a tad smaller and also turned them inwards a bit. Now the drawing was done and it was finally time for the fun part, inking. And keep in mind that I didn't use real ink here but a digital drawing tablet, just a side note. And the first thing I did here was to fill in the so-called spot blacks, the completely black shapes. In this case, the first was the background, which was completely dark, the inside of the mouth, where kinda no light gets in this case, and several other areas. For example, cast shadows under the cape and under the chin, and also form shadows, like on the side of the head in this case. Also, there were a lot of smaller shadows, like in the face under the mask, around the eyes, and also all these smaller neck muscles he has. Now, what's important is at this stage, the drawing should actually already look kinda good, you know? Kinda atmospheric and nice, basically. Because all that's remaining is, well, the thing that's arguably most important, details. Even without those details, it should already look kinda good. But the details are the last thing that make it look really awesome. And actually there's no real secret to drawing details. It's basically a lot of scribbly lines and dots that kind of follow the forms. Todd McFarlane, the creator of Spawn, does this a lot, where he kind of just draws a lot of lines and dots and little shapes. You have to be careful with this, it can be overdone. He even once famously said, "You guys call it inking, I call it noodling." But then again, I think I didn't even draw enough of those little details, because when I was zoomed in, it kind of looked pretty good already and detailed and stuff. But later on, when I zoomed out on the final product with all the colors and stuff, I think I could have drawn even more details, to be honest. But live and learn, right? Now, another important technique I want to show you is cross-hatching, especially at the shadow edge. You probably know that cross-hatching is kind of just drawing lines in one direction and then crossing them. And in this case, I did it at the edge of the shadows. Very important, not at the edge of cast shadows, but only form shadows. Cast shadows tend to have hard edges, while form shadows can have softer edges. And in this case, the cross-hatching kind of made the edge softer, so I only used it on form shadows. And I kind of used this technique so long and drew strokes in several directions until you kind of didn't see the lines anymore, but just a gradation from the black to the white. Because what this does is it kind of resembles a gray value. You're actually just painting with black and white, but the cross-hatching, when you look at it from afar, it kind of looks like a gray value. Because your eye is not able to see those individual lines anymore, but it will kind of interpret it as a gray value. And the same thing actually happens here in the light areas, where I'm drawing all these details, and the more of them you draw, like here above the teeth, the more it starts resembling a gray value, which in this case actually is a midtone. You have the black shadows, the white light, and the gray midtones. So finally it was time for comic book coloring. The first step here was to just paint in the flat colors, the basic colors of the objects. The red cape, the gray costume and the green eyes. And once this base was established, I kinda just continued with an airbrush tool, which is basically just a soft brush. Now, the way I looked at this was the black areas, the shadows were already kinda defined by, well, being black. And for the typical comic book look, I would not use any indirect light or something, I would just use completely black shadows. So the shadow areas were pretty much done. What I did here with the airbrush was just to add a little bit more three-dimensionality into the lighter areas. So I basically added a few highlights, but I didn't make them too bright because I still wanted the local color to shine through. The basic costume should still look gray, so I couldn't make the highlights too bright. So I chose a rather bright gray tone, but not exactly white. Now, the mask is already white, of course, so I couldn't really paint anything brighter on that. So instead I painted some light gray tones as midtones, basically, in the areas where, well, the mask, the form of the mask, would turn a little bit away from the light. After that I rendered the cape a bit. Once again, the shadows were already established by the black tones of the inking phase. I just added some midtones here as well. In this case, a slightly darker red tone and a brighter tone for the highlights. And what I did here is I didn't just use a brighter red tone, because that really quickly starts looking like pink. Instead I used a brighter red tone and turned it a little bit towards orange. This actually fits very well, and also it adds a little bit more color variation to make your drawing or painting much more interesting. After that I shaded the teeth and the chain around the neck, and well, I was almost done at that point. I would now just add some finishing touches. And one thing I did was I added a cool glow effect to the eyes. Basically all I did was I picked the green tone from the eyes, used a soft brush and lightly painted over it, so that the green color would bleed into the black, but you wouldn't lose the shape of the green eye. So I was basically painting with like 50% transparency. And this made the eyes look less flat and more, well, like they were actually glowing. What I also did was I added a slight vignette to the painting. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically just a small gradient towards black at the edges of the painting. Once again I used a soft brush with light pressure and painted over the edges at the bottom here. This makes it look a little bit more atmospheric and, well, puts a little bit more attention on the center of the image, the face. Now the last little detail I painted was once again the white of the mask. Because actually if you look at the inks, the mask would be completely in shadow. But obviously I couldn't paint it black because you would lose the shape entirely. So I left it white. But how could I show that it was in shadow? Well, I just used a gray tone instead. So this way you could see that the mask is actually three-dimensional a bit and that it's in shadow, but you can still see that it's supposed to be white and you don't lose the actual shape of that part of the mask. So, what about the actual art challenge here? Did I win? I don't know yet, but I'll tell you in the pinned comment down below. So, see you there and thanks for watching.